It is an honor for me to be here with you today and to talk about this topic. This is by far my favorite subject to talk about. When I was invited to come here, I was invited to come and speak about perinatal mood disorders, and I do treat perinatal mood disorders, but I really see mood disorders, substance abuse disorders, all connected through really one mechanism, and that is through attachment. It turns out we are very social animals, and how we attach to people becomes the source of both our greatest joy, but also some of our biggest problems. And this will follow very nicely, I think, after Michelle's talk that she gave you, so we'll touch on some of the things she talked about. So things I'm going to talk about today, we're going to talk about attachment theory, what it is, where it came from, and how I think it plays into certainly perinatal mood disorders, but pretty much everything we do. I am going to talk a little bit more about the neuroscience of this, because that is, again, that is my passion, and that is how I understand attachment, is really through the biological mechanisms, and I'm hoping to share that with you. We will talk a little bit about some of the very interesting research studies that have been done, both with children to understand their brain development, but also how we as parents may develop an attachment to our children. We're going to talk a little bit about the psychiatric and the medical sequelae of insecure attachment, and that will overlap very nicely with sequelae of trauma that we just heard about. And then I'm going to end on a hopefully what feels like a positive note with how do we address this, how do we treat this, and some ideas about that and what we do in our clinic. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. What is attachment theory? So this is John Bowlby. John Bowlby was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst in England around World War II. And at that time, it was pretty much assumed that as long as children were clothed and fed, that they would be fine. And when London was bombed by the Germans, what people would do in London is they would send their children out to the countryside to be cared for. And of course, the parents had to stay and work in London, but they wanted to protect their children. So they sent them out, sometimes to family members, but often to strangers. And it was assumed that they would be fine. Well, John Bowlby actually studied these children and sure enough found they were not fine. They were sorely depressed because they had just left their primary caregivers, right? Now, today, this sounds completely intuitive to us, but at that time, that was a very big deal. He also started studying children in the hospital. At that time, it was considered a nuisance to have the parents with the children when they were hospitalized for whatever reason. So they would take the children, hospitalize them, tell the parents to come back in a month and pick them up. And he would study these children and again found that they were very, very depressed, okay? So from these studies, what he concluded were really two main ideas that I want you to keep in your mind. One is that there is a sensitive time to this attachment that happens between a child and a primary caregiver. I'm going to say mom a lot, okay? The primary caregiver does not have to be mom. It could be grandma, it could be father, it could be cousin, it could be nanny. But if I say that every time, it's going to take me forever to get through the talk. So I'm just going to say mom and assume I'm talking about primary caregiver, okay? So one is there's a sensitive time period, and that is considered to be really the first 2 years of life. I think it's probably even earlier than that. I think it's probably the first year of life, and we'll talk about the neuroscience and why I think that. But the other thing that he sort of came to from this was that when we have that primary attachment, it creates an internal working model for all our future relationships. So that primary attachment, whether it's mom or grandma or whoever, is now going to guide every relationship that that child has for the rest of their lives. That is pretty powerful, right? So that was his theory. Along with John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth was a psychologist. She was wonderful, and she really began to classify this attachment system that we have. And she divided it up, and we'll get into this in a minute, into secure attachment and insecure attachment. And she came up with a way to study kids around 12 to 24 months of age to figure out if they were securely attached or insecurely attached. This is called the strange situation. Some of you have probably heard of it. It is still considered the gold standard of how to decide if a child is securely attached. In short, what it is, a parent will take their child into a room, and of course they're being watched with cameras and through one-way windows, etc. They watch the mother interact with the child, then the stranger walks into the room, and they watch how the mother and the child interact around the stranger. Then the mother leaves the room. Now the child is alone with a stranger. This sounds traumatic. They do it for about 30 seconds, sometimes up to 60 if the child can tolerate it, but if they can't, they really shorten it to 30 seconds. And then the big piece is what happens when mom comes back in. How does the child respond to mom? Then the stranger leaves, and then the mom sort of soothes the child, then the mom leaves again. The child is now alone. Again, they're watching what happens, and then the mom comes back in, and it's over. So the whole thing takes about 20 minutes. But Mary Ainsworth designed that, and like I said, it's still the gold standard for determining secure attachment. So what is secure attachment? When everything goes well, the baby cries, the mother soothes it, the baby's hungry, the mother feeds it. The mother provides a secure place for the child to have their needs met. They learn that mom is generally a helpful person. She's reliable. She's sensitive to the child's needs. She's teaching the child empathy because through all this, she's empathizing with the baby, right? So there's all kinds of positive feelings that come from this relationship when all goes well, okay? This, again, creates an internal working model later on, right? So when you put these moms and these kids in the strange situation, the mother leaves the room, the child becomes visibly upset, but the child is able to kind of pull themselves together. And then when the mother comes back into the room, it is a warm welcome. It is a very good feeling. The child is finally relieved. The mother is able to soothe her baby, and they go on with life, and it's fine. Things don't always go well, right? So with insecure attachment, what do we see? So there's actually different classifications. There's anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized attachment. Most of the insecure attachment that we see is anxious or avoidant. Disorganized attachment is what happens in orphanages if there is really no primary caretaker at all, right? The child becomes very disorganized with that, and some children actually die from not having a primary care attachment. But in anxious attachment and avoidant attachment, these are both considered insecure. With anxious attachment, mother is most likely unreliable. Sometimes she's there, sometimes she soothes the baby, but sometimes she doesn't. And the baby can't decide and can't tell when mom is going to actually be there and help them or when mom is too busy or what have you, right? In avoidant attachment, we see pretty severe neglect. So mom really is not there most of the time, or we also might see abuse. So mom may hold the baby, but may also harm the baby, or may shake the baby in response to the baby crying. So not soothing, not warm, not cuddly, nothing like that. Intimacy feels scary, right? So with anxious attachment, what we see in the strange situation is the child becomes very distressed when the mom leaves. When the mom comes back, she's not able to soothe her baby. It takes the child a very long time to settle down. And in fact, the child may get mad at the mom and start hitting the mom, right? You left me. Why did you do this to me? I don't like this, right? And the mom doesn't know what to do with that. So then the mom gets mad at the child all over again. And you see this sort of pathological routine go on between them. With avoidant attachment, again, it comes from neglect. Usually the child has learned early that mom's not going to be there. You take care of your own stuff, okay? If you're upset, you fix it. I'm not here for you. I'm not going to help you. You work it out, right? So when the mom leaves the room, the child does not become distressed. The child is sort of there playing with a toy or maybe interacting with a stranger. You know, don't let the door hit you, mom, whatever. They know mom left, but they're not going to act like they did. And then when mom comes back in, same thing. They don't go up and hug mom and thank goodness you're back. I missed you so much. No, it's like, oh, you're back. And they go back to playing with their toys. That is not a good sign. That is avoidant attachment, right? In disorganized attachment, again, these are people with really no primary caregiver. You see them literally walking around in circles. They don't know how to handle their emotions. There's just no organization at all or coping strategy that these children have to what they're feeling, okay? So that is the quick summary of secure and insecure attachment. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of this. So why do I think that the first year is so important in this process? Well, when you start to look at the brain development, it all happens in that first year. It is crucial, okay? So some of these parts of the brain we're going to talk in more detail about. The hypothalamus, which you heard in the previous talk, what that has to do with stress and cortisol, we're going to talk about that. The hippocampus comes on around 3 months of age. Really important, it turns out. The amygdala is super important. That develops around 6 to 8 months of age. And then, of course, the rest of it comes online throughout, and then prefrontal cortex more into adulthood, adolescence and adulthood. So, start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is formed at birth, okay, but it has pretty much an on or off function. So we can kind of modulate our cortisol levels. The babies don't do that very well, okay? So the hypothalamus is, you can see all the things it's responsible for here. It's a lot. The two things I want you to pay attention to, one is the corticotropin releasing hormone, and that is what causes cortisol to be produced by the adrenals, okay? So it is sending direct messages, you know, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, stress, 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 and the cortisol level goes up, right? So the newborn is screaming, I need some food. The shutoff valve, along with food, obviously, for the hungry child, is a hormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is something you may be familiar with. We know that it is produced during labor, for instance, when we go into labor and give birth to our children, and it also goes up during breastfeeding. Okay, this is not an accident, this is not a coincidence, nature did this on purpose. It is probably the biggest shutoff valve for cortisol in the newborn's brain. Okay, this is really important. So that relationship, it turns out, is super important. In addition to breastfeeding and childbirth and orgasms, which also produces oxytocin, it's produced with skin-to-skin contact. So for moms who are not nursing, we try to really encourage skin-to-skin contact, right? It's good for mom and it's good for the baby. It's producing oxytocin. It calms everybody down. This doesn't go away as adults, by the way, right? So all of you can go home and cuddle with your significant other, your children, your pets. Oxytocin goes up, cortisol goes down, everybody calms down, okay? So it really is an important hormone. So cortisol at high doses is neurotoxic to the brain. It kills brain cells. For a newborn baby, this is not a good thing, okay? It's not a great thing for any of us, but certainly not for a newborn who's trying to make new neural connections, right? They're born with lots of brain cells that are now trying to connect and work together. So killing off some of those brain cells is not a good thing. At low doses, cortisol actually is what we call neurotrophic. It actually encourages brain connections and brain growth and development. So oxytocin is the modulator of cortisol. Okay, so we need oxytocin. That baby needs oxytocin on board on a regular basis. So even if the baby's stressed because they're not hungry, they're cold, they're colicky, having mom constantly there trying to soothe the baby is super duper important. So the baby may be colicky and mom says, I don't know what to do. Just keep trying. You're there, you're helping the baby. They will still develop oxytocin and start to calm down from that, right? And think about it. A problem is always easier if we feel like we have somebody there with us who says, I get it, I'm with you, we'll do it together. Okay, the next part of the brain to develop is the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is also really important. So it's important for our emotions, it's important for what I call giving context, right? It has a memory component to it. So it gives context to what is going on with our emotions. It's also important with spatial orientation and navigation, but that's a little bit less interesting in terms of attachment. But for attachment, it is about learning who is my mom, and I remember her, and I like her, and this feels good, so it connects the emotions to the context. What is really cool is this is around the time we start seeing babies smile at their mom. So you can see, the hippocampus, yes, it's there, right? So it just got connected, okay. So here's the thing about the hippocampus. It has more cortisol, or what we call glucocorticoid receptors, than any other part of the brain. So within that 3 months, the first 3 months of life, if we have let our babies scream it out, right, and we're not soothing them, we have already caused damage to the hippocampus. And this is important for learning, for memory, for organizing our feelings, right? So you can see the long-term consequences of harming the hippocampus. It's really important. Okay, the amygdala. I love the amygdala. When I was in medical school, we learned that the amygdala was really there for fear, and that was all it was important for. But we have learned since it is much more important for all kinds of things. It is involved in fear and stress and all of those things, but it's also really important in determining what we call salience. Okay, now what does that mean? It means I would look out here in the audience, and for many of you, I've never seen you before. For others, I've seen you before, and for others, I may know you well. If I know you well, my amygdala is probably going to light up. I see you, it's important to me. If my children walked in the door, my amygdala would really light up, right? Or if my husband walked in, or if my mom walked in, for instance, my amygdala would light up. That's a salient, important person to me. So the amygdala comes online around 6 to 8 months of life, okay? And this is important because this is around the time when the child, they're learning how to crawl. And this is a big deal because now they can move away from mom. And that's scary, right? So there's fear, but they also know mom's the one who protects me. She's the one I go to for safety, right? So you see both of those, and this is around the time when moms start freaking out because they think they're never, ever going to go to the bathroom by themselves ever again, right? Because the child will not let them out of the room, right? This is, you're like, oh, your amygdala, this is great. But that's not how moms feel necessarily about it. So emotional memories, fear, and salience, super important. This is just within the first 8 months of life, right? So really important in attachment. Okay, so what is some of the data that I'm even going by when I tell you this? So this is a pretty cool study that they did. They took children who had been raised, or who were born in early life, had been raised in orphanages. I believe it was Romania. And they were adopted into America by American families. And they compared their brains in the fMRI scanner. This is when they were older. The kids were between 4 and 17 years of age. They put them in the scanner, and they showed them a picture of their adopted mothers. And then they took children who'd been raised by their biological parents the whole time and showed them a picture of their mother. And as you might predict from what I've just told you, their amygdalas lit up. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Here's the thing, though. When they took the children who were raised by the biological families and showed them a picture of a woman who was a stranger, their amygdalas didn't light up. And you would expect that it wouldn't because, they're not scared of her, but she has no salience. The children who had been adopted, their amygdalas lit up with a stranger as well. So it lights up with adopted mom, but it also lights up with anybody who walks in the room. And what that tells us is they can't tell who's salient in the room. They can't walk into a room and say, you're my safety person. You're the one I go to for help. You're the one I need. And they would then, it was interesting, they did an NPR interview with these kids, and they said, I do feel differently. Now, who knows, if any of us start talking about how we feel about our mothers, my guess is we're all going to feel pretty differently. But those kids seemed to feel that they were missing something, and the scanner seemed to indicate that as well. This is a busy slide, and so I'm just going to let you listen to the story that I'm going to tell you, because this kind of blew my mind, and it gets into some of the trauma that you were hearing about in the previous talk. So this is a rat researcher. Her name is Regina Sullivan. She's at the Nathan Klein Institute in New York. And she did an absolutely brilliant study. So she's interested in attachment, but what happens with attachment when there's child abuse in play there? So what she did, she took these baby rats. Baby rats have what they call an attachment period of 6 days. And they don't produce what their equivalent of cortisol is during those 6 days, so they won't be afraid of anything. They'll attach to anything that comes in front of them during those days. During those days, what they did was they took these rats and they paired a foot shock with a particular smell. Now, for rats, the smell is very much part of the attachment, okay? So for us, smell is important for our attachment as well. We smell our mother's first thing when we're born, and we like our mother's smell. We prefer her smell to anybody else's. But for rats, this is exaggerated big time, okay? Because they can't see, they can't do anything else. They really focus on the smell. So they would introduce these foot shocks together with a smell, assuming that these smells were considered attachment smells, right, because of the period of time. Now, we know that child trauma and abuse leads to depression later on. So they would let these baby rats grow up, and the way you test for depression, bear with me, it's a little crude, but it's accepted in the rat research world, is they stick them in a jug of water, and they see how long they swim. Okay, it's a little crude, I told you, but this is the accepted way to look at depression in the rat model. So they would put these rats in the tub of water, and sure enough, they give up very quickly, which is a sign of depression, okay? Now, they would, while they were swimming and starting to give up, they would introduce the smell that was associated with a foot shock. And of course, they predicted that they would be more depressed when they had that smell. The opposite happened. In fact, she thought she had done the experiment wrong, so she did it again. Her colleague over in France was doing it independently, and she was terrified to call her friend because she's like, I keep screwing up the experiment. And her friend in France says, I'm getting the same exact data. Now, this is really powerful stuff, right? Because it teaches us, number one, that we are indiscriminate with our attachment system. We don't judge when we're babies who and what we get attached to. If abuse is part of that, we become attached to the abuse. So Freud would say, when we see people who are abused as children get into abusive relationships one after another, he would say they're doing it to get it right? They're trying to undo what happened to them as kids. No. What this shows is there actually is a reward process to that. It feels good to these kids and adults, right? So helping somebody overcome abuse when they've been abused as children, this is very difficult, right? The other piece that this tells us is that the reward system is intricately involved in attachment. And this is not a surprise, because babies don't do what they're supposed to do because you tell them it's good for them. Babies do what they're supposed to do because it feels good, right? They eat because it feels good. They cuddle and snuggle because it feels good. They get attached because it feels good. So the reward system is very much part of attachment. It feels good. If abuse is part of it, it probably messes up the reward system a little bit, which is why we see so much substance abuse with insecure attachment and trauma, right? They're completely linked neurobiologically. So this is a picture. They were showing the neurobiology of the parts of the brain that are involved in substance abuse and the reward system. And sure enough, it's all the same parts of the brain I just talked about. The amygdala, the hippocampus. It adds the nucleus accumbens, part of the striatum, which probably some of you have heard about. But that's all part of the attachment system as well. And it is developing all in that first year of life. Okay, really important. Okay. So, what about the parents? What happens in the parents when they have a baby? How do they get attached to their kids, right? So this was a study that actually was done many years ago, and my husband was kind enough to enroll me in it. So this might be my brain up there, I'm not sure. But basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at how we attach to our babies within the first month of life, and if we do. So what they did is they said, okay, now go take pictures of your babies, go take pictures of objects that remind you of your babies, and record your babies crying, and see, then I'm going to show you these pictures, or I'm going to let you listen to your baby crying while you're in the scanner and see what happens. The short story is, for the mom, within 2 to 4 weeks, her amygdala lights up, right? It's not because we're afraid of our babies. It is because the baby is salient. It's like, oh yeah, that's my baby. And they would let us listen to other babies too to see if there was a difference between hearing our baby, if is this indiscriminate? Do we just get excited when any baby cries? Oh no, we knew our babies. And our amygdala only lights up with our babies, right? So that's pretty cool. The dad, the slide on your right here, is the picture of the dad's image doing the same thing within 2 to 4 weeks. So his amygdala isn't lighting up yet. However, when they image the dads later on, say 4 to 6 months later, their amygdala lights up too. So is that because dad's slow? No, I don't think so. I think what happens is mom has been attached to this baby since, 4 weeks of pregnancy, right? 8 weeks of pregnancy. We know we're pregnant. We've started to get attached early on. We've had months to get attached to this baby. Dads are not quite as attached to a belly in their, even if they're happy to be, having a baby, but it's not the same experience. But once the baby's out, the attachment starts kicking in pretty fast, right? Okay. I'll just check on time here. Okay, so oxytocin. I had mentioned to you this is the shutoff valve for cortisol, super important hormone. What is really interesting, when you look at where the receptors are for oxytocin, it maps on exactly to the reward circuitry. Same exact area, right? So how do we calm ourselves down? How do we make ourselves feel better? Through oxytocin, okay? But not all of us produce oxytocin the same way. I'm actually going to skip this slide for time. This is a slide showing parents interacting with their children and measuring oxytocin levels. It turns out moms cuddling with their babies increases her oxytocin. Dads, they need more stimulatory behaviors with their babies. When they sit and cuddle, their oxytocin goes up a little bit, but not as much. What they like to do is they like to, throw them up in the air. And when my husband started doing this with our son when he was born, I was freaking out completely, going, oh my God, what are you doing? And it turns out he's doing it right. He's getting their oxytocin going, right? He's doing it his way. So we're a little bit different, but we both produce oxytocin. This is probably one of my absolute favorite studies that has ever been done. So what they did was they said to dads, okay, I want you to play with your baby, and we're going to measure oxytocin and see what happens in you and the baby. Okay. And so dads played with their babies, and their oxytocin, you can see here, goes up a little bit, the light gray line, and the baby's oxytocin goes up a little bit. It kind of mirrors what dad's doing. Okay. Then they said to dad, okay, here's some intranasal oxytocin I want you to snort. And so dad inhales some oxytocin, right, some synthetic oxytocin. He inhales it. That's very nice. And they say, now play with your baby. Okay. And then they measured oxytocin level. So dad, the darker line, his oxytocin spikes. Well, that's no surprise. He just snorted it. So that makes sense, right? But look at what happens to the infant's oxytocin level. It mirrors dad's. It turns out this is a contagious process, right? The baby did not, the dad's not nursing the baby, so we know the baby did not ingest it. This is simply from interacting with dad, whose behavior is altered ever so slightly by inhaling oxytocin. Really powerful stuff, right? What gets more powerful is when we start to understand that certain women do not produce oxytocin in the same way. So we know from this study that if you've been abused, that your oxytocin levels are lower, right? You're at risk for depression, we know this, but we also know your oxytocin levels are lower. So you have less of a shut-off valve for your own cortisol. When you have a baby, if this is truly contagious, what does that mean for her baby, right? Is her baby not going to get the oxytocin spikes it needs simply because she had trauma as a child, right? So now this starts to get to why this is intergenerational, right? Trauma is an intergenerational process. This was a study actually looking specifically at attachment. So mothers with secure attachment, when they play with their babies, their oxytocin level goes up. Mothers with insecure attachment, their oxytocin levels actually went down when they played with their babies. So this was not necessarily a feel-good moment for insecurely attached moms, right? They may have memories of their own trauma growing up or what happened, but this is not necessarily a feel-good moment. Again, you can start to see if this is contagious. You wonder what happens to their babies when they're playing with them, what happens to their oxytocin levels, and you see the intergenerational process. More studies looking at mothers who are synchronous and intrusive. It doesn't map exactly onto attachment, but it's very similar. So again, they did a study looking at moms who were sort of in tune with their babies, and then had them play with their babies and then watch themselves play on a video while they imaged them. And again, their oxytocin levels would correlate to that. Moms who were a little bit more intrusive with their babies, not necessarily in sync, when the baby looks away, instead of taking a break, mom is like, no, play with me, things like that. So it wasn't quite synchronous with what the baby needed. When she watches herself, her oxytocin level does not correlate with a feel-good moment. Right? Okay. So what are the sequelae? Again, this kind of gets into what Michelle was talking earlier. So insecure attachment, it turns out, leads to all kinds of psychiatric illness. Certainly addictions, depression, absolutely perinatal depression, pregnant and postpartum depression absolutely links into this. Anxiety disorders, eating disorders, and personality disorders. So why is that? Why do we think this happens? I think the simplest answer is the internal working model is not positive. And if you feel that you have to go through the world alone and work out your own stuff and manage your own stress, and you don't have a shut-off valve for your cortisol levels, it is going to lead to other either coping strategies or other ways that the brain responds, and that leads to mental illness and addiction. It has also been linked to medical conditions. So avoidant attachment in particular has been shown to lead to chronic pain, headaches, diabetes, and even cancer. Anxious attachment leads to stroke, so you see more cardiovascular stuff, stroke, heart attacks, hypertension, and also ulcers and diabetes. So it has real medical consequences for us when we do not have supports. This was a study that we actually did in the OB clinic at Eskenazi. Yeah, 5 minutes, thank you, yeah. And basically what it shows is that we looked at the ACE score, so the ACE score that they just talked about, Michelle just talked about in the last talk. We looked at the ACE score, we looked at attachment, and we looked at depression, and there was a very positive correlation between the ACE scores of greater than 4 and depression in these moms who were both pregnant and postpartum. So we know that early trauma to these moms lead almost directly to depression and anxiety in pregnancy and postpartum. Okay, so I want to end on a more positive note. So when is the time to intervene? So this is really what kind of led me into this field. The more I learned about it, the more I recognized we have to help these moms, and probably not when the child is 5, but probably when she's pregnant and even early postpartum. And so that is sort of what led to the perinatal clinic. So we have some things on our side during this time. So mom's oxytocin levels are normally rising during pregnancy. So we have that on our side, and we want to sort of harness that and use that to help her with her attachment system. Mom's attachment issues really come into play when she's about to have a baby. It becomes really important what mom's experience with intimate relationships is like when she's about to be intimate with her baby and do skin-to-skin contact, and if that feels good or not. But of course also it impacts the baby, right? It impacts this whole new life, this generation. So early screening is key, and what I'm really trying to push is for OBs in particular to use the ACE score. So even if mom is not depressed, even if they do an Edinburgh depression rating scale and it's low when she's pregnant, if her ACE is 4 or higher, they should have her on alert and offer her maybe social support, psychotherapy, anything. Why wait till she gets depressed and we then have to medicate her and put her and her baby at risk? Why not go ahead and get her into some kind of therapy before and help her with these issues before the depression kicks in, and we might be able to actually prevent it. Pediatrics is also important in this. OBs see moms at 6 to 8 weeks, and as long as she's not bleeding at that time, they say, good, I'll see you next time you're pregnant or for your annual, and that's the end of that. And so who sees the mom during that first year of life more than anybody else? The pediatrician. So I'm really trying to push for pediatrics to use this as well, to try to screen mom for trauma, to see who can they encourage to get into therapy and get some help. This is a type of treatment that we use. It's an attachment-based treatment. It's called Circle of Security. It requires a certain training. But basically, the premise is there's 2 components to all of our attachment relationships. The bottom of the circle, which is our need to be soothed, to be comforted, to have our feelings organized sometimes when we feel distraught. And then the top of the circle, which is our need to have a safe base from which we explore our world and then have somebody to come home to and say, guess what I did today, or guess what I saw today, or what have you, right? We do this with our kids all the time. It doesn't go away when we're adults, right? You go home and you want to tell your significant other, this is what happened to me today, or I had a bad day, and you might need a hug or something like that, right? Our oxytocin still soothes us. This is what I like about the Circle of Security is it takes something so complex as parenting and it simplifies it into this idea of a circle. It obviously is more complex than what I have time to explain right here, but it is what we use in our clinic, and it has been shown to decrease depression in pregnant and postpartum moms. It's also been shown to reverse insecure attachment in toddlers when they do it with their parents. It's been used in substance abuse populations and depressed populations, and it is very effective. Connecticut has over 500 people trained to do this. New York has over 200. New Mexico has over 600. Indiana has like 5. We're getting there. We're moving. So the more I talk about it, the more I hope people sort of catch on and say, we need that. But we use this in our clinic, and it's incredibly effective in helping the moms recognize the importance of attachment. These are just some studies showing that the circle security has been beneficial. So I think I'm going to stop there for the sake of time, because I want to make sure if you have questions or concerns that you have time to bring them up. So thank you for your time.